When a country that built its identity around energy independence discovers that its energy independence depends entirely on maintaining good relationships with a neighbor it had been taking for granted, the power dynamic shifts in ways that reshape everything. I've been analyzing energy policy and strategic resources for decades, and I can tell you that the revelation of American energy dependence on Canada represents one of the most profound shifts in North American power relationships since World War II. Not because the dependence was newly created, but because it was finally acknowledged. For years, American political rhetoric about energy independence existed alongside energy infrastructure that made independence impossible without Canadian cooperation. The public story, as it's been sold to American voters, painted a picture of energy dominance and strategic independence. Domestic oil production was rising, renewable energy was expanding, and political leaders spoke confidently about American energy security as if it were a completed achievement rather than an ongoing challenge. The rhetoric was designed to project strength and self-sufficiency in a world where energy security translates directly into geopolitical leverage. But the reality behind that rhetoric was far more complicated and far more humbling for American strategic planners. American energy infrastructure had evolved over decades to depend on Canadian resources not as a temporary convenience, but as a fundamental component of national energy security. Oil, natural gas, electricity, and critical minerals flowed south across the border in quantities that made Canadian cooperation essential to American economic survival. The psychological moment when this dependence became undeniable came during a series of energy security briefings where American officials were forced to confront the arithmetic of North American energy flows. When you strip away the political messaging and look at actual infrastructure dependencies, the picture that emerges is of a country whose energy independence is largely mythological. Let me walk you through exactly how this dependence developed, because the mechanics reveal important truths about how modern energy systems actually function. Energy independence isn't just about producing enough energy within your borders. It's about maintaining energy infrastructure that can operate independently when necessary. American energy infrastructure was designed for efficiency and cost optimization, not for independence from Canadian resources. The electricity sector provides the clearest example of this structural dependence. Power grids don't respect national borders, and the North American electrical system was designed as an integrated network that optimizes energy flows across the continent. Canadian hydroelectric power doesn't just supplement American electricity generation, it stabilizes American power grids, provides backup capacity during peak demand, and supplies consistent baseload power that American renewable sources can't reliably deliver. When political tensions threatened the reliability of this integrated system, American energy planners discovered that substituting Canadian electricity with domestic sources wasn't just expensive. In many cases, it was technically impossible without massive infrastructure investments that would take years to complete. Regions of the United States literally couldn't keep the lights on without Canadian power, regardless of how much domestic energy production existed in theory. The oil and gas sector revealed similar dependencies that contradicted public rhetoric about American energy independence. Canadian oil sands production had become so integrated into American refinery operations that many American facilities couldn't process alternative crude sources without expensive modifications. Pipeline networks, storage facilities, and refinery configurations had evolved around Canadian supplies in ways that made substitution costly and time-consuming. This integration worked beautifully when it was treated as a partnership between friendly neighbors. It became a strategic vulnerability when political rhetoric began treating Canada as a competitor rather than a collaborator. The moment American officials started talking about energy relationships in terms of dominance rather than cooperation, they highlighted dependencies they had preferred to ignore. Canadian officials understood this dynamic perfectly and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of threatening to cut off energy supplies, which would have been economically damaging for Canada as well as America, they simply began highlighting the importance of stable, cooperative relationships for maintaining energy security. The message was clear without being confrontational. Energy flows require political stability, and political stability requires mutual respect. What made this Canadian approach particularly effective was how it combined practical necessity with diplomatic pressure. American energy officials couldn't argue with the technical realities of infrastructure dependence. and American political leaders couldn't ignore the implications of energy vulnerability for domestic economic stability. When energy security becomes a political liability, policy priorities shift rapidly. The broader implications of this energy dependence extended far beyond technical infrastructure into fundamental questions about American strategic autonomy. When your neighbor controls critical resources that your economy depends on, that neighbor gains leverage over your domestic and international policies, whether they choose to exercise that leverage explicitly or not. This leverage became visible in how American officials began approaching policy decisions that could affect Canadian interests. Trade disputes, regulatory decisions, and international positions were increasingly evaluated not just for their direct merits, but for their potential impact on Canadian cooperation in energy matters. When energy security depends on maintaining good relationships, those relationships become strategic priorities. The economic implications reached deep into American regional economies that had built their identities around energy production. States that promoted themselves as energy powerhouses discovered that their energy infrastructure couldn't function independently of Canadian resources. The gap between political messaging about energy independence and economic reality created cognitive dissonance that political leaders struggled to address honestly. From Canada's perspective, this recognition of American dependence created opportunities that Canadian leaders had never actively pursued but couldn't ignore once they became apparent. When your resources become essential to your neighbor's survival, you gain influence over your neighbor's behavior whether you want that influence or not. Canadian energy policy began reflecting this new understanding of Canada's strategic importance. Instead of simply reacting to American energy decisions, Canadian officials began making energy decisions that Americans had to react to. The relationship dynamic shifted from accommodation to mutual dependence, but with Canada holding more cards than American political rhetoric acknowledged. What's particularly striking about this transformation is how it revealed the gap between American political culture and American strategic reality. Political leaders could talk about energy independence and dominance, but energy infrastructure operators had to deal with the practical requirements of keeping systems functioning. When rhetoric and reality diverge so dramatically, policy becomes incoherent. The international implications of American energy dependence on Canada extended far beyond bilateral relationships into global energy politics. When other countries observed that American energy independence was largely mythological, it affected how they approached their own energy relationships with America. If America couldn't maintain energy independence from its friendliest neighbor, how credible were American guarantees of energy security for other allies? This credibility gap became visible in how international energy partnerships were structured. Countries that had traditionally looked to America for energy security guarantees began developing alternative arrangements that didn't depend on American capacity to deliver energy independence that America hadn't achieved for itself. When the guarantor can't guarantee its own security, the guarantees become worthless. The technological dimension of American energy dependence on Canada is equally significant, but less visible. Modern energy systems depend not just on fuel sources, but on critical minerals, specialized equipment, and technical expertise. Canada's dominance in mining, hydroelectric technology, and energy infrastructure development made American energy independence dependent on Canadian technological capabilities. When political relationships affect access to these technological resources, energy independence becomes even more mythological. You can't maintain independent energy systems with dependent supply chains, and American energy supply chains were deeply dependent on Canadian resources and expertise in ways that political rhetoric never acknowledged. The most sobering aspect of this entire revelation is how it demonstrates that energy independence requires not just domestic resources, but domestic political wisdom that prioritizes long-term strategic relationships over short-term political advantage. Energy systems are built over decades and depend on stability that extends beyond electoral cycles. When political culture undermines that stability, it undermines energy security regardless of domestic resource abundance. For American strategic planners, the recognition of energy dependence on Canada forced a fundamental recalibration of what energy independence actually means in practice. True energy independence would require massive infrastructure investments, technological development, and political stability that American political culture had proven incapable of maintaining. The alternative was accepting dependence and managing it through stable relationships rather than denying it through political theater. The energy stranglehold reveals more than a policy failure. It reveals the consequences of building political identity around myths rather than realities. When energy independence becomes a political slogan rather than a strategic objective, policy becomes disconnected from the infrastructure requirements that make independence possible. And when that disconnection becomes apparent, the political mythology collapses in ways that reshape power relationships across an entire continent. As this reality continues to sink in for American policymakers, what becomes clear is that North American energy relationships have fundamentally shifted from American dominance to Canadian leverage. The country that spent decades taking its northern neighbor for granted has discovered that its northern neighbor has become indispensable to its survival. And once that shift in leverage is acknowledged, it can never be completely reversed, regardless of how much political rhetoric tries to wish it away.